So I have said week in and week out through the series that the Sermon on the Mount is not a ladder that we climb to get God's love and blessings or to get more of God's love and blessings. That's the way I understood it growing up. The way I understood it growing up was that the Sermon on the Mount was a goal to reach, that if to the degree that you can live this way, you will get more of God's love and blessings. But the Sermon on the Mount is not a ladder we climb to get God's love and blessings. It's a merciful wall that we crash into so that we will finally admit that we can't be everything we need to be. That's the role that God's law plays in our lives. It exposes us, it unmasks us, it shows us our need, it reveals to us that we can't do it on our own, we can't make it on our own, we can't make ourselves right with God, we can't make ourselves right with ourselves, we can't make ourselves right with others on our own, that it requires a work of God to do it. And so God's law, his demands, the high expectations that he reveals here are intended to expose us, to unmask us, and to show us our need. Because it's only when we finally admit that we can't do it on our own that we discover God's grace, that we discover God's forgiveness, that we discover God's love. Stacy and I have a friend, she's like a younger sister to us, named Joy, and she said this a couple weeks ago. I don't think you can understand scandalous grace until you find yourself in scandal, in desperate need of grace. I thought that's a remarkable line. I told her, I said, I'm going to steal that. I'm not going to give you credit for it. I'm going to take it from you. And she responded and said, I've stolen so many of your lines. Go ahead. But I think the thing that caught my attention with that is that oftentimes it can be so misunderstood that you have to really blow it big on the outside, or you have to really screw up publicly to be in scandal, to find yourself in scandal. But that's not the case, because if that were the case, I'm sure there are plenty of people paying attention online, or plenty of people in this room that would go, I haven't really had any real scandal in my life. So are you telling me that without that kind of a scandal, I can't discover God's scandalous grace? Or more accurately, God's scandalous grace won't discover me? And no, that's not what I'm saying. We don't have to blow it big on the outside or screw up publicly to find ourselves in scandal. It's a scandal to try to make ourselves right with God. That's a scandal. It's a scandal when we try to make it on our own, when we try to do it ourselves. That's a scandal. In that sense, when we are guilty of doing that, which is all of us all the time, we are actually functioning as atheists in that moment. We don't believe in God. I mean, we do theoretically, we do maybe intellectually, but we really need to make this happen on our own. We have to do this. We have to fix this. We have to change this person. We have to change ourselves. It's all up to us. We have to make it happen. But the Sermon on the Mount exposes the various ways that we try and do this to make ourselves right. And in these verses, Jesus confronts the most common way we try to make ourselves feel right. Oneupmanship. It's very common. We do it all the time. Oftentimes it may be unconscious. Other times it may be very conscious. But one of the ways we try to make ourselves right, or to make ourselves feel right, is one-upmanship. Now, I'll get back to that in a second, but let me say a couple of things about these verses regarding do not judge, because they're oftentimes misunderstood. So let me say at the outset that the phrase do not judge here does not mean the absence of discernment. It's not what it means. Or the absence of wise analysis. That's not what Jesus is saying. We are called, and in fact we do, make judgments every day. And we're supposed to be wise in our evaluation of situations and people, and to make wise choices based on those judgments. So Jesus is not saying throw wisdom to the wind here. It's not what he's saying. Oftentimes these verses are spoken and said in such a way that's like, well, you have no right ever to evaluate me. You can't. I can do whatever I want and you can't say anything about it. That's not what Jesus is saying. He's not saying throw wisdom to the wind. He's not telling us to discard the distinctions between right and wrong, truth and lies, and so on and so forth. He's not promoting relativism here. Relativism is the idea that truth is whatever you want it to be. that all things are morally equal, or that all ideas and actions are beyond the scope of moral evaluation. That's not what he's championing here. What he is addressing here is a self-righteous disposition of the heart. That's what he's addressing. He's addressing our natural tendency to think that we are better than others, which we're all guilty of in one way, shape, or form. He's talking about the deeply embedded pomposity that resides in all of our hearts. He's addressing our propensity to deny the rightness that God freely gives in favor of our own sense of moral rightness. That's what he's talking about. What I call the distinction between righteousness developed, which is on us, and righteousness delivered, which is on God. When we focus on developing our own rightness, developing our own righteousness, we become proud, we become self-righteous, and we become judgmental toward people who we think haven't developed as far as we have, aren't as far as we are. But when we rest in righteousness delivered, the rightness that God freely gives, we become humble. We become grateful kinds of people. We become more gracious. We become more forgiving. We realize that we didn't do anything to deserve this rightness. It's been given to me as a gift. I needed it because I couldn't get it. I couldn't develop it. And therefore, that gives us a more gracious disposition toward other people. It even gives us a more gracious disposition toward ourselves. Because when we refuse the rightness that God gifts us, we have to find rightness somewhere. And the most natural landing place to find rightness on our own is ourselves. And the best way for us to establish our own sense of rightness is by identifying the wrongness of other people. That's what Jesus is addressing here, specifically. Last week, we looked at the subtle and not so subtle ways that we seek attention, credit, affirmation, love, those things that we crave and we feel like we have to work for if we're going to get it. And I called it salvation by recognition. We're all guilty of it in some sense. I call this salvation by comparison. And we see it everywhere. It's impossible to miss. We see it everywhere. Not only do we see it, if we're honest, on our own hearts, but we see it in our culture, especially all over the place. All over the place. It really began in the Garden of Eden, didn't it? When the serpent tempted Adam and Eve and they ate the fruit because they wanted to be like God. And when God showed up, what did Adam say? It was the woman you gave me. This is the problem. And when God looked at Eve, she's like, it's the serpent that you put in the garden. So therefore, ultimately, God, it's your fault. Trying to establish a moral high ground, even with God, in their case. And we've been dealing with that ever since. Everywhere we look, people are calling out other people. Everywhere. If you haven't noticed this, just spend an hour or so today on Twitter. I don't recommend it, but if you want this point to be proven, I suggest that you just spend a little bit of time on social media today to see whether or not what I'm saying is true. Everywhere we look, people are pointing out the faults and failings of other people. Someone once told me that Matthew chapter 7, verses 3 and 4 are the two most ignored verses in the Bible. The ones I just read, where Jesus said, why are you so fixated on the speck in your brother's eye when you have a log in your own eye? It was a mentor and a friend of mine that said, in all of his experience, he thinks that those two verses are probably the most ignored verses in all the Bible. Now, whether that's an overstatement or not, the point stands. I understood what he was saying. We all naturally ignore that truth, those verses. We seem addicted to identifying and exposing the flaws of others. It's like a drug. It makes us feel higher, even if only for a moment. I've quoted my friend Nadia before, who says so poignantly, our drug of choice these days seems to be knowing who we're better than. That is just all around us. And more scandalously, it's inside all of us. In fact, one of the most effective ways to avoid our own faults is to hide behind the obvious faults of someone else. It's easy. Salvation by comparison, feeling better about ourselves if we can identify the badness in other people. As long as my focus is where you are bad, I feel better. That's something that we do. It was a poet, a non-Christian poet by the name of John Mark Green. I saw this a number of years ago, and it's such an exposing line. He says, "The self-righteous scream judgments at others to hide the noise of skeletons dancing in their own closet." And remember, where there is judgment, there are secrets. That's all over the place. It's so easy and oftentimes unconscious to deflect people's attention away from our own faults and our own weaknesses by identifying and pointing out the faults and weaknesses of other people. As long as others are focused on them, they won't be focused on me. As long as I'm focused on him or her, I won't need to focus on me. It's constantly passing the blame of guilt to other people rather than seeing it in ourselves. Well, this type of moral snobbery exposes just how enslaved we are to securing our own sense of rightness. Now, let me issue a warning here. I've issued this warning before because this is something I am guilty of all the time. It's the warning against becoming judgmental against those who are judgmental. Becoming a Pharisee to the Pharisees. Becoming self-righteous toward those who are self-righteous. This is the way it goes. And this is specifically true for those of us who believe in the particularity of this message, the message of grace, that we all need God's grace. And there are a lot of people inside and outside the church that just don't get that. We get a lot of pushback. I've gotten pushback for years, over a decade now, from inside the church people saying things like, you know, you talk too much about grace, you talk too much about God's forgiveness, as if that's even possible. Okay? You talk too much about God's love, as if that's even possible. There's a lot of pushback, and my tendency is to become judgmental toward those people, and this is kind of the way it goes in my mind. I know I'm bad, you think you're good, and that makes me better than you, okay? That's the irony. So whether you're a grace person or not a grace person, it doesn't mean that if you're a grace person that you aren't guilty all the time of self-righteousness. We can become self-righteous about our grasp of grace. I get this stuff. I know where it's at. I'm with God on this. You're not. That makes me better than you. Like I said, I know I'm bad. You think you're good, and that in and of itself makes me better than you, okay? That's the kind of self-righteousness I find I am oftentimes most guilty of. You know, I get so frustrated when people who should know better, inside the church people, Christian people, bite the hand that feeds them in the sense that they're always saying, yes, grace, but. Yeah, I get it, but come on, let's keep this whole thing balanced. Okay, I get so frustrated, and in those moments, I want to lash out and say, you just don't get it. I get it. You don't get it. And that makes me healthier than you. That makes me better than you. Now, that's true, of course, but at the same time, we should recognize that as the kind of disposition of heart that Jesus is calling out here. Because he doesn't mince words in these verses. He calls us all out. Jesus does. He's not specifically talking about religious people. He's not specifically talking about non-religious people. He's not talking about good people. He's not talking about bad people. He's talking about all people. I've said this before, but the Bible makes no distinction between us and them. It only makes the distinction between us and him. All of us and him. He's the one who is separate above and beyond, not us from one another. Jesus wants us to know that it is the summit of hypocrisy to spend our time confessing the sins of others while never confessing our own. That's one of the things I see probably most often on social media, this call-out culture where we're constantly calling out the missteps or the wrongs or the faults or the weaknesses or the failings of other people, and yet never talking as openly or as passionately about our own faults, our own weaknesses, our own failings. It is the apex of blindness, Jesus wants us to know, to point out the flaws of other people while ignoring our own flaws. That's what he's saying when he says, why in the world do you spend so much time and energy pointing out the speck in your brother's eye and ignoring the log in your own? Remember in John chapter 8, the woman caught in adultery, we've looked at that passage many times. The religious leaders wanted to trick Jesus, and so they caught a woman in adultery in the act and dragged her out to the town square and threw her before Jesus. And they wanted Jesus to say, yes, stone her, because that's what the Old Testament law says. And Jesus, of course, says, you who are without sin, cast the first stone. And they all sort of dropped their rocks and walked away. Well, the problem with the religious people in that scenario was not that they said she was guilty. She was. She was caught in the act. I mean, it's not like they were blaming an innocent victim here or dragging an innocent victim out to the city square. I mean, she was guilty. They caught her in the act. That wasn't the problem. The problem was that they thought they were innocent. That's what he calls out. He didn't say, she's not guilty. You guys are wrong. Your judgment of her is wrong. Their judgment of her was actually correct. Their evaluation of the situation of her was actually right. That's not what Jesus was addressing in that situation. The reason he got upset with them and said what he said is because they actually thought they were innocent. And no one really knows what Jesus wrote on the ground with his finger in that scene. But there's a part of me that wants to believe that he said something that he said in Matthew chapter 5. If you've ever looked at a woman lustfully, you're just as guilty of committing adultery in your heart. That's what he wanted them to know. This was probably a year and a half ago. There was a well-known Christian leader. This has happened actually a lot in the last decade. But there was a well-known Christian leader who fell pretty hard. And because he was a public person, he fell very publicly. And every Tom, Dick, and Harry on the internet had something to say about it. Everybody had an opinion about it. Everybody speculated as to who this person was and why he did what he did and all of those things. And I was so frustrated by the fact that these people were pointing out the speck in his eye while ignoring their own. And so I put this out on social media on the day that the news became public. I just said, the first words out of our mouths and the deepest cry from our hearts when a Christian leader is exposed should be, God be merciful to me, a sinner. That's what the first response should be. And the amount of pushback I got was unbelievable. Unbelievable. How can you say you're just giving him a license? I'm like, okay, no, this is not about giving a license in or ignoring the wrongdoing or not saying that what he did was bad or horrendous or detrimental or destructive. That's not what it is at all. But when our first reaction, when our impulse, when our natural instinct is to go, look at what he's done, rather than go, I am just as capable of that and much more. God be merciful to me, a sinner. I think it says something. I think it says something about the disposition of our hearts. It revealed to me, that little episode revealed to me once again just how natural it is for us to truly believe we're better than other people. I remember when in about a year after everything happened with me in 2015, same sort of thing. Every Tom, Dick, and Harry had an opinion. People I didn't know, complete strangers, were, basement bloggers, were writing stories and speculating and whatnot. And there were, social media battles and arguments going on about my sin. And I didn't know any of these people. And my son, Gabe, was living with Stacy and I in Texas at the time. And he was just sort of obsessed with this. And so he looked at me one day and he said, Dad, why are these people who have nothing to do with everything that happened whatsoever? They weren't affected by it. They weren't impacted by it. But they spend so much time and energy talking about it and pointing it out to other people. Why? He really was confused. And I said, Gabe, I can't speak for every person who has an opinion on this, but I can say this, that all of us in our hearts fundamentally believe that we're better than the worst person we know. We actually believe that. And this is the kind of way in which that belief is expressed when we spend so much time talking about the faults and the weaknesses and the failings of other people. And it doesn't have to be someone well-known. It could be someone close to you. It could be your fixation with your husband or your wife's weaknesses or their faults or ways in which they fail to meet your expectations. And inside, by your kind of thinking to yourself, I'm not guilty of that. Or if I am, I'm not guilty of that as much as she is or as much as he is. We do this with friends, family members, coworkers. We do this all the time. Interestingly, the only people Jesus ever called out publicly were those who called out other people publicly. Isn't that interesting? The only people. Okay, you would expect that Jesus would call out, like when the religious leaders dragged the woman caught in adultery out to him, he would be like, you guys are doing a good job. You caught her in the act, you called her out, you're holding her accountable. That's exactly what I'm looking for. That's not what he said, okay? He was distraught by the fact that they thought they were better than she was, and they were calling her out publicly, and Jesus called them out. So the only people that Jesus ever called out publicly, read the Gospels and find this out for yourself, but the only people that Jesus called out publicly were those who called out other people publicly. We believe in our heart of hearts that we are less capable of badness than other people. And that sense that we have that we're less capable of badness than other people makes us feel right. It makes us feel better. It makes us feel superior, morally and otherwise. But maybe Jesus' disposition, which is completely different, maybe this is the reason why Jesus himself was canceled by his culture and ours. The scandal of his forgiving love and grace to those who are guilty is just too vulgar for a culture that has to find some comfort in dealing with the uncomfortable log in our own eye by pointing out the speck in someone else's. This is why he's an uncomfortable figure. I think it was Robert Capon who said Jesus didn't come to show us how to be good. He came to expose our caked conventions by which we think we're good. That's what he was doing to the religious people in that scenario, and that's what he does to us. That's what he does in these verses. That's what he's talking about. But hearing Jesus' word that I have a log in my eye, that I'm blind and that I'm broken, not him, not her, but that I'm blind, I'm broken, that takes away the scorecard that I cling to in helping me think I'm better than you. That's what this is why this is such a merciful wall. This is why, because for Jesus to say, Tullian, you have a log in your eye. There are people all around you that have faults and who have failed and who have weaknesses in 1,000 different ways. And they have logs in their own eye too. But you have a log in yours. That's what I want you to hear. I don't want you to hear that everybody else has a log in their eye. I want you to hear that you have a log in your eye. That you're blind, that you're broken. And hearing Jesus say that takes away the scorecard that I cling to in helping me think I'm better than you. It helps me see that we are all, no matter who you are, we are all on the same level playing field of needing grace. All of us. Every single one of us. No one in this room is better than anyone else in any other room, anywhere. That's hard to grasp because if you're like me, you can come up with a catalog of some really nasty people that you go, okay, I hear this, Tullian, yada, 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 but I'm not Jeffrey Dahmer. He clearly was worse than I am. I'm not this person. I'm not that person. Democrats say it about Republicans. Republicans say it about Democrats, and people who try to stay in the middle say it about both, okay? We do this all the time, all the time. Again, Jesus is not saying here, discard all sorts of wise evaluation. That he's not promoting moral relativism here. That's not what he's doing. What he's doing is exposing us to ourselves, showing us that we are the guilty ones. Not that everybody else is guilty, even though they are, but that's not where he wants our focus to be. He wants our focus to be on the fact that we're guilty, because it's only when we come to the realization that we have a log in our own eye that we become, like I said earlier, maybe a little bit more humble, maybe a little bit less prone to point out other people's faults and failures. Maybe we become more gracious when other people do fall and fail. Maybe we're a little bit more quick to forgive because we know how much forgiveness we've been given. Maybe it makes us a little softer rather than a hard-edged kind of person. It makes us a little softer. I think it was Barbara Brown Taylor who said that Christians are never at their worst than when they think they're defending God. And that's true. No one is not in need of grace. No one. I said this last week, but we all need grace because we fail. We all need grace because we lie, because we get mad when we don't get our way, because we gossip, because we're judgmental, because we're impatient, because we're not thankful, because we're selfish, because we hold grudges, because we want forgiveness from other people, but if someone hurts us, we don't want to forgive them. We all need grace for that stuff. We all need grace because we're proud, because we use people, because we're controlling, because we're greedy, because we're more bothered by other people's sin than we are our own. We all need grace. No one is not in need of grace. And this is why this wall is so merciful, because it shows us that. God's law, his demands expose us. It shows us that we're not as good as we think we are. We're not as strong as we think we are. We're not as capable as we think we are. We are all desperately in need of grace. Jesus was always making the better thans mad. Always. The people who thought they were better than. He was always making them mad because he befriended, loved, and touched the outcast, the leper, the liar, the adulteress, the cheater, the sexually deviant. Grace always provokes those who think they're good. Always. Grace always disrupts those who think that they're better, those with a high anthropology. Always. Jesus loving and embracing the falsely accused, the victim, the one who is not guilty, that's not scandalous. Okay, I mean, that in fact is expected. For Jesus to sort of love and embrace and defend the one who's not guilty, the innocent victim, that's not a scandal. That's not what got Jesus in trouble with the religious people, okay? In fact, his stock would have skyrocketed had he been more like that with the religious people. Had he been calling out everybody and their mother for all of their deviancy and all of their sins, the religious leaders would never have championed his crucifixion. Never. They would have crowned him as their leader. So it's not a scandal for Jesus to love and embrace the person who's not guilty. It's expected. What is scandalous and what really pissed him off was the fact that Jesus stood with the guilty, that he loved the unlovable, that he forgave the unforgivable. That was something that in their minds was unforgivable. This man clearly cannot be a man of God, because no man of God worth his salt would ever embrace the kind of riffraff that this man embraces. He wouldn't be standing with the guilty, he would be calling them out. He wouldn't be standing with those who seemingly are unforgivable. He wouldn't be forgiving them, he would be calling them out. You see, what offends scorekeepers like me the most about Jesus, if I'm being honest, is not who he leaves out, but who he lets in. I can't tell you how many times I've thought to myself, if that person goes to heaven, I don't want to go. Or at the very least, this place better be as big and as expansive as the Bible says it is, so I never have to see him, ever. I mean, what offends, it's hard for me to believe that God can love some people who have really hurt me. People who have damaged me in one way, shape, or form. It's hard enough for me to forgive them. What's even harder to believe is that God forgives them. Like it just seems like God doesn't care about what's right and wrong if he's just throwing around forgiveness left and right. It just doesn't seem like it matters. But what offends scorekeepers like me is that fact. Not who he leaves out. That wouldn't offend me. There's a whole host of people that I wouldn't mind him leaving out, okay? It's who he lets in, who he embraces, who he loves, who he forgives. You see, the good news of God's love and forgiveness is not just for those who are bullied and brokenhearted. It is, but it's to perpetrators themselves. It's not just to the ones who are experiencing pain because of what someone else has done. It's to those who have delivered pain. That's the part that makes us a little uncomfortable. Not just to theoretical sinners, but to actual flesh and blood repeat offenders like me. The fact that he welcomes and embraces the immoral, the guilty, the blamable, that is what makes him such a misfit God. Such a misfit God. The fact that he welcomes and embraces the immoral, the guilty, the blamable, that's what makes him just not quite fit in. You know, he doesn't really meet our expectation of what a God should do, what a God should be. This is like a bizarro God, you know? It's kind of like, you know, you see this throughout the Gospels, especially in the parables. Jesus is, you know, he's loving the wrong people, he's forgiving the wrong people, he's giving gifts to the wrong people, and the people who seemingly have it right, who've kept the rules, who dot their I's and cross their T's and are very self-righteous about it, those are the people that Jesus calls out. It seems to me that self-righteousness is sort of the biggest, most seemingly intolerable sin to God. Because self-righteousness is, in essence, a stand against God. It's I don't believe in the righteousness that you offer. I don't believe in the rightness that you give freely. I'm going to secure my own. And the best way for me to secure my own is to point out the wrongs of everybody else so that I feel more right. It's a self-salvation project. And it just seems that of all the people in Jesus' life while he was here on earth, all of the people that we read about, it was those self-righteous sort of better-thans that Jesus had the most trouble with, that he struggled the most with, and who struggled the most with him. See, it is anti-grace. I would go so far as to say it is anti-Christianity to remember people primarily by their worst moments. And then in remembering them by their worst moments with the authority invested in us by the state of self-righteousness, we proclaim, we are better than you. We are better than you. We make an announcement, at least in our hearts. But the truth is, all of us are way more complicated than that. All of us. We've done some very good things. We've done some very bad things, and most days we stir a mean cocktail of both, good and bad. Sadly, most people, I speak from experience on this, most people only remember the bad. But thankfully, we have a God who only remembers the good, only because of what Jesus has done. If we want to reduce our life story down to one adjective, then let's take a cue from Jesus when he calls us beloved. That's who we are. We sang about it this morning. I am a child of God. Whatever else I am, okay? I'm a lot of things. I'm a husband, I'm a dad, I'm a grandfather, I'm a diehard Dallas Cowboy fan, I'm a fast driver, I'm an adulterer, I'm all these things, okay? There's 1,000 different adjectives that would be accurately descriptive of my life for the last 50 years. But the one thing that identifies me, my identity is not in those things. My identity, who I am, ultimately is beloved, a child of God. That's what defines me. What I do or don't do or have done or will do, that doesn't define me. What defines me is God. God defines me. God's love and adoption of me, his acceptance, his affection, his care for me, the fact that I am a child of God. I have been adopted into the family of God, and it's a family I can never unadopt myself from. That's who I am. That's what Jesus calls us, beloved. That's the big difference, I think, between Jesus and cancel culture. While our culture, including the church, cancels people who have done terrible things, Jesus cancels the terrible things that people are canceled for. And that's all of us. Thank God. That's what Jesus did on the cross. That's what Colossians says, that he paid the debt. He canceled the debt. That's the word that's actually used, canceled. How ironic. That if there is a canceling that Jesus is all about, it's canceling our debt. It's canceling the judgment that we would otherwise rightly receive and deserve from God because of how far fall short we have fallen from what God requires. The sins and scandals that we choose to forget, that we choose not to forget, Jesus chooses not to remember. I've said that 1,000 times. And it's a line that I will keep reminding you of, and it's tattooed down my right arm. Well, may the accuser roar of sins that I have done. I know them well, and thousands more. My God, he knoweth none. None. My sin is cast into the sea of God's forgotten memory. That's tattooed right here. See, I need these. That's why I get tattoos, because I'm dumb, okay? I need reminders of what's true. Tetelestai right here, which is Greek for it is finished. I wake up every morning going, oh my gosh, I woke up. I didn't want to wake up. I wanted to just sort of pass in my sleep and go to heaven. And then I look and go, tetelestai, it is finished. I can rest. I can exhale. See, he may not remember our sins and he may not remember our scandals. And by the way, it's not that he can't remember. He's omniscient. He's God. Omniscience is the big theological word that means God knows everything. Nothing's hidden from God. The psalmist talks about this in a variety of different places. Nothing's hidden from God. He sees all. He knows all. So it's not like God can't remember our sins. It's that he chooses not to remember them. That's even more gracious, that he chooses not to. He makes a decision to forget, to forgive and to forget. What he does remember, however, and what he never forgets is that he loves sinners, that he's a friend of sinners. He's a brother of the outcast, and he's the God of 70 times 7 forgiveness. And so as we wrestle with the fact that we are guilty of all of these things that Jesus tells us not to be guilty of, he points out the foolery of pointing out the speck in our brother's eye while ignoring the log in our own, and we're all guilty of it in one way, shape, or form. Some of us may be more guilty of it than others, but we're all guilty of it. And if you're this much guilty, it's no different in God's economy than if you're this much guilty. It doesn't matter. It's like that old illustration that Max Lucado uses where he says, let's just say the only requirement God has is that we jump to the moon. That's it. Forget all the 10 commandments. Forget everything else. Let's just jump to the moon. And he said, some people may jump 6 inches, and some people, Olympic jumpers, may even jump 6, 7, 8, 9 feet. But compared to the hundreds of thousands of miles it takes to get to the moon, who cares? Well, that's like us. Someone once gave the illustration to me about the way we see sin and the way God sees it. It's like a stack of plates on our head, 15 plates high. And we see it horizontally. So if I look at one of you and you got 15 plates stacked on your head representing sin, I'm like, whew, it's a big sinner. He's got a lot of stuff. He's got a lot of things. God sees it from the top. And when you see it from the top, you don't see 15 plates. Okay, the only way that illustration falls short is that God doesn't see any plates at all. That because of what Jesus has done, all of that stuff has been forgiven and forgotten. And like I said, the one thing that he does remember about you and about me and about him is that he's our friend, that he's our brother to the end, and that his forgiveness has no bounds, that we will continue to incur debt, but that debt has been forgiven. Past debt, present debt, and future accumulated debt, forgiven, forgotten. Let's pray.